So there's going to be some light spoilers in this video, but can I just say that the pacing on The Ones Who Live so far has been kind of fantastic. Like, I know it kind of has to be because 6 episodes does not leave much room for the show to do what The Walking Dead used to do a lot of, which was spend 5 or 6 episodes showing everyone's story at different times and then finally in the 7th episode actually show what's happening with them. But focusing on 2 specific characters in The Ones Who Live gives us a chance to really delve into each of them in a way the main show never really got to do. Like, I know Daryl Dixon and Dead City both focus on a very few set of characters, but both those shows also felt a little bit more plot focused, with the character stories being important but more secondary to what the story was, whereas here it feels like the characters are central and are the story. Michonne and Rick and their internal and external struggles are more important and integral to what this show is than whatever the CRM is really doing, which I think is a really, really smart decision. But I think something this says, at least to me, is that your mileage or your enjoyment of The Ones Who Live is really tied to how you feel about Rick and Michonne as characters. Like, this is a show that feels tailor-made for people who love the two of them, which it should be. But like with Dead City, there are enough new characters and the plot is so important that if you don't like Maggie or Negan, the show still has a lot to offer. Similar as Daryl. Like, I'll be honest, Daryl Dixon is pretty far down my list of Walking Dead characters. Never really seen much of the appeal of his character, but I think the France stuff and the new characters in Daryl Dixon are interesting enough that even though I don't love Daryl as a character, that show is still really good. Now, I love Rick and Michonne, but I'd be interested to hear if there are any fans of the franchise who don't like Rick and Michonne and are watching this show, because I want to know how they feel about it. Like, 2 episodes in, this does kind of feel like a show that completely dies if you're not very interested in these 2 stories and these 2 characters. Going back to pacing for a sec though, I really do appreciate that this entire episode wasn't just catching Michonne up to the end of last episode, because it easily could have been, and to be honest, I wouldn't have complained about it because it was such a good episode in general up until that point, but around 15 minutes from the end, we're already caught up. We see the last scene of last week again, but from Michonne's point of view, that's exactly where a lesser show would have ended the episode. A lesser show would have caught us up to exactly there, and then that would have been it, credits. But The Ones Who Live doesn't. They keep going, and we get 15 minutes of that reunion and seeing what comes next for both Rick and Michonne, and that was great. But that easily could have been the beginning of next week's episode, and people probably wouldn't have complained, but no, they added that in here anyway, and it's great. One thing I mentioned during my review for episode 1 was that I was a tiny bit disappointed that in that episode we started 6 years in for Rick, so we didn't really get to see him immediately arrive at the CRM, and we kind of just started after he'd been there for 6 years. Episode 2 does the complete opposite with Michonne. For her, we get to see her story start in the exact place that her last appearance on The Walking Dead ended, with the same characters and her heading towards the same group, and that was really welcome. Because while for Rick, there's still a sense that we haven't seen his whole story, between this episode and the Michonne flashbacks during The Walking Dead Season 9, where we saw what she was at during the bridge, we do get a feeling that we know exactly what Michonne was doing and where she was for most of her story since she first appeared back in Season 2 of the main show. And just in general, while last week really was a showcase for how fantastic Andrew is as Rick, this episode was a fantastic showcase of how amazing Denai is as Michonne. Like, I genuinely think some of my favourite acting from Denai in the entire franchise comes from this episode. Like, she was fantastic. But this episode also introduces a few characters. Like, we got to meet a new character called Nat. We were properly introduced to Aiden and Bailey after them just barely being in their first episode over in the main show. And another thing that I think The Ones Who Live is absolutely nailing is their ability to introduce characters and make them feel fleshed out and real within one episode. Like, these 3 characters are to Michonne as all the new CRM characters were to Rick last episode, and they all feel great in this one. Nat, for example, is easily my favourite new character introduced across the spin-offs since the main Walking Dead show ended. Over the course of like 45 minutes, you really get a sense of how him and Michonne really come to trust each other and really feel like they're the only friends the other one has in the world at the moment. It's really masterfully done. There is one thing I'll mention though, and this isn't really much of an issue for me, but I can easily see how some others would consider this an issue, and it's the fact that Nat here is used in the exact same way as Okafor is in the first episode. A brand new character introduced and killed in the same episode, both characters essentially serving very similar purposes for both Rick and Michonne. It does feel like kind of the whole point of the characters may have been to introduce them just to kill them, but honestly not something I overly felt, because I think the stories of both Nat and Okafor were good enough to justify what happens. But I can see that kind of being an issue for some people from like a writing perspective of, you introduce both these characters in these 2 other characters' lives at the exact same moments, kill them at pretty much the exact same moments as well. Kind of get it, but for me I didn't really feel that too much. Alongside the new characters though, we get some time skips, since this episode covers 4 to 5 years of time, and they handle that pretty well too. You do get a sense that time is passing pretty quickly. We get some cool montage style bits using leaves to show seasons changing, and at times the way the episode depicts weather does kind of feel like the late stages of season 9 of the main show during the Whisperer War. This episode did give me some vibes to other things as well though, like the usage of horses and such felt like really like a mix of Last of Us and Red Dead Redemption 2, but there's also a show that came out in late 2022 called Station 11. It's great if you haven't seen it, definitely check it out, but it's set 20 years after a virus kind of spread around the world, and the way this episode approached showing Michonne travel to the US really reminded me of that. The new community and the way they travel also kind of reminded me of Station 11, but something that the main show kind of touched on in their later season, like season 9, 10, 11, is kind of the mixture of different eras of the world now. That time is moving on in the apocalypse, like we see kind of medieval stuff meshing with modern day stuff, and it's really cool. I think The Ones Who Live is also nailing that sort of connection between the two, like these two worlds meshing, because the first episode with the CRM felt very much like a modern look at what an apocalypse would be. Well, this episode is definitely much more heavy on like the medieval aspects and the more kind of old war techniques sort of coming into how you would deal with an apocalypse. I think it's really, really, really cool. Like last episode, a lot of guns, a lot of helicopters and stuff. This episode is a lot more kind of medieval style weapons that we saw in the later seasons of The Walking Dead show. I think it's really cool to see those differences. But this episode was also just full of parallels to Rick. Like there's a moment at the end with Michonne standing in front of a CRM helicopter that feels like it's meant to parallel Rick getting picked up by them at Bridger's terminal in The Walking Dead final. And the music is also combinations of a ton of things we've heard before. Like we get some resurgences of that main theme that played at the end of the main show, the same thing that ended up actually being part of the main theme for this show. But they also use music cues from like Michonne's last episode on the main show, to the point where it really feels like seasons 9, 10, and 11 of the main show were being written, or at least being planned right alongside The Ones Who Live, which is something I really didn't expect, because back then this was still planned to be a trilogy of movies, so it feels like they would have had to change a lot to make it fit to a miniseries instead, but that's really cool anyway. Another really cool thing is that we also see the first appearance of the CRM from Michonne's perspective with the group she's traveling with, and it's terrifying. They found a really, really effective way of having them appear and making you just fear them instantly. Super cool to see the opposites of how Rick is dealing with them and how Michonne meets them, and kind of once again the differences between the two worlds, which I feel like last episode and this episode was supposed to do, show the complete polar opposites of what both characters are dealing with, what both characters are going through, how the world is for both characters at the moment, and the next episode will kind of be the meshing of those two properly. I did have one complaint though that I only really felt in the last quarter of the episode, but the dialogue once Rick and Michonne got back to each other felt like it kind of started to stumble pretty heavily in my opinion. Now there's a certain insult that the Walking Dead fandom used during seasons 6, 7 and 8 to describe how dialogue sounded or felt. It was named after a certain showrunner, I'm not going to use the insult here, but it was this kind of dialogue where characters would say something that just wouldn't really make any sense. Like they'd go, "I'm here, but I'm not here," kind of thing. Morgan was really, really, really bad for that in the later seasons of Fear the Walking Dead. But in the main show around the Negan arc, there were a lot of characters saying things in a really confusing way that just meant nothing. Like when you really kind of broke down the line that they just said, you were like, well, that kind of doesn't mean anything. And it was kind of like the dialogue was trying to be profound and deep, but it just ended up sounding dumb. And I personally felt like towards the end of the episode, there was kind of a return of that style of dialogue. Like one of the Rick and Michonne scenes has Michonne ask Rick if he knew what the CRM was doing out there. And Rick kind of just says something similar to, "I knew, but I didn't know, but deep down I knew." Like I can't remember the exact line, but it was something like that. Like what? You can have that so much simpler. Have him just say something like, "I never really knew," or "I never knew for sure." I mean, I'm not writing the show, obviously I'm not getting paid to do that, but that kind of dialogue to me always screams that they're trying to make something sound more clever or drag something out a little bit more than it is. Like I remember when I was doing screenwriting in college, we were kind of always told like, never say what the character means in dialogue, which I always felt like that was a little bit stupid. I feel like if it feels natural, it shouldn't matter if the character's just saying how they feel. I feel like a lot of people in general just like that in shows and movies as well. When characters don't drag a conflict out, they just say what they mean. But the way that it happens in The Walking Dead doesn't really feel like they're trying to hide how they feel. It just feels like they're trying to drag the line out a little bit more, and it ends up sounding like nothing. Do really hope that that kind of dialogue ends in this episode and isn't too prevalent in the rest of the season, but it's a minor complaint, and it was also only after a certain point. I didn't really feel that at all in the first 45 minutes of the episode. But what did you think about The Walking Dead, The Ones Who Live, episode 2, Gone? Did you like it, hate it, better than the first episode, worse? I think I prefer the first episode slightly, but this is an extremely close follow-up. Genuinely not a lot of complaints I have about the show so far. Like, my major complaint last episode was that I didn't feel like the exposition dialogue really hit that much, and this episode, kind of my major complaint is just the dialogue is a little bit weird as well towards the the end of the episode. But I mean, in general, like, I love The Walking Dead as a franchise. I don't think the dialogue has ever been like the main strong point of the show, so it's not like I'm going, oh, the dialogue in The Walking Dead was in the main show was so good, why isn't it not so good here? It's kind of just something I gotta point out. But if you enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and all of that, and I hope you have an amazing day.